Britain focuses on the impact of local and national government. Okay, so we're going to look at the public health measures to improve the urban environment and government responses to the gin craze, which we see from 1660 to 1751. So a bit of an overview just to begin with, just to know in terms of what we see in terms of impact of local and national government. Authorities, what they try and do is to improve urban environments, to improve environments in towns. Now, both national and local governments put more measures in place to tackle public health problems than they had done in the medieval period. Okay. And as the plague's eradicated, new public health problems emerge, and that's what we see with the gin craze. So authorities trying to improve towns. We know that we've seen those first national public health policies. The government relied solely on local officials, particularly in towns, to implement these measures. And when there was times where there's no plague and when the plague was finally eradicated, efforts started to focus on keeping towns clean. And York is a really good example of that. And it's the orders given by the aldermen of York in the 1550s that we can see just kind of exemplify how the ideas are all around trying to keep the town clean. So, for example, the fines were put in place for any dung heaps or the throwing of urine and excrement onto the streets. Households had to clean the street outside their houses, and people in York were told to clean those areas, and then they couldn't put their waste out for scavengers until after 7 p.m. And there was people were encouraged to have their cesspits emptied regularly, and animals weren't allowed to wander the streets. Okay, so we do see some attempts here now just to kind of make sure towns are clean and improve public health in that respect. While all this is going on, the impact of local government kind of slightly later in the period from 1670 to 1750, again, that focuses on towns, and towns are improved, but these improvements are mainly for the rich, and the improvements concentrate on making towns pleasant places to live. So the problems of waste disposal and sewage issues are still not dealt with. It is about making places much more pleasant to live. Okay, and London is a great example of that we see water companies bringing piped water to people's homes. Again, this is a luxury just for the rich. And in the centre of towns, large houses are built for the wealthy and streets are lit, and in some areas streets are paved. But the conditions in poorer areas are not improved, and the problems that are associated with the privies and the cesspits are still not dealt with. Okay, there's still a massive problem in terms of causing the seepage of sewage and waste into water supplies, and the diseases and the spread of bacteria. All of that is still an issue that is not dealt with. Okay. Now, we've talked about the fact that there were some attempts to improve health and improve towns, and then that national government has a new issue to deal with. And the new issue that government has to deal with is that of the gin craze. And this becomes a health problem in 1720, and it becomes a serious issue. Okay. Now, gin becomes popular as it is really cheap, and we know that events at the time when we looked at this proclaimed drunk for a penny, dead drunk for 2 pence. All right, and alcohol was sold widely, and we've talked about the fact, as we've just said, it's incredibly cheap, and therefore we see thousands of what are called small gin shops open in cellars and back rooms and attics, and it's a big health and social problem in London. Like hundreds of thousands of poor men and women are turning to gin to escape the misery of their lives, essentially, and the lack of work and their poor living conditions. And they're using kind of drinking as a means of escape, if you like. And alongside drunkenness, then we also get an increase in crime, the ruin of families, and an increase in death rate. Okay, men and women both becoming addicted to gin, and the impact then in terms of on families gives the gin this name, mother's ruin, because we know that women who drank while pregnant and ended up with babies being born deformed, hence this name of mother's ruin. Okay. Now, the government obviously sees the health and kind of social issues linked to gin and realises that measures are going to need to be put in place to stop the gin craze. Okay, and the measures take place in stages, and we see in 1729, if you like, the first phase of dealing with the gin craze, and that is that alehouses have to have a licence, and the licence costs £20 for sellers of gin, and there's a 25p tax per gallon for producers of gin. Now, this is pretty limited and pretty difficult to enforce because of the number of these small gin shops. As we've said, they were everywhere, in kind of cellars and small rooms and attics and sheds, and even sold from like barrows in the street. So this was really difficult to enforce, and so had limited impact in its initial phase. Now, by 1736, we get a second Gin Act put in place. This tax we then see is that producers of gin, the tax goes up to the equivalent of £1. And the licence fee goes for selling of gin goes up to £50. Okay, and again, the effectiveness of this act is very limited. It fails because of the similar reasons we see in the first one. Okay, there was actually even rioting against this law, and many people start distilling, so making gin in their homes illegally. So the first two acts to try and deal with the gin craze are ineffective, right? And so we see the consequence of that being the Gin Act of 1751. Can't read my own writing here, 1751. And we see a change this time, okay? It's a much tougher act than any of the previous acts, and we see harsher punishments for the illegal selling of gin, okay? So anyone caught selling gin could be imprisoned. If they were caught selling gin as a second offence, they could be whipped, okay? And if there was a third offence, that could result in transportation. And transportation, we know, meant that people would be removed and sent to Australia, okay? And this Gin Act does work. Consumption, the amount of gin drunk does fall, okay? And it shows that kind of finally, at last, the national government has got to grips with this major health problem in England.